afternoon, everyone. My name's Paul Sherry. I'm a member of PPLIR Europe. We have a stand downstairs, A5519. Please feel free to come and visit us afterwards. This afternoon, I want to just share a few thoughts about a topic that's fairly close to my heart for a couple of reasons. And I want to try and take what I call an evidence-based approach. Now, what do I mean by an evidence-based approach? Although I'm a flight instructor and an examiner instrument rating instructor, I'm also, my other day job, I'm an orthopedic surgeon. And in clinical medicine, we try and make decisions based on the best available evidence at the time. Not always successfully, I hasten to add, but at least that's what we try and do. And this seemed to me a subject with a fair amount of opinion involved, and I wanted to try and look a little bit and dig a little bit deeper and dig below the surface. I mentioned that I'm an instrument rating instructor in the UK, I'm a class rating instructor, also an examiner, and I spend quite a lot of my time when flying sitting in the right-hand seat watching students trying to fly mainly on instruments, teaching them, and maintaining a level of situational awareness is something I see them struggle with. So really the underpinnings for this talk was to try and find out for me how I could help my students do a better job, and I hope some of that is useful for you. So what are we going to do over the next 45 minutes? Well, firstly, we're going to actually try and define exactly what situational awareness might be. Secondly, we're going to look at something which can be described as SA demons, or you'll see more in a moment, the enemies of situational awareness. And then we're going to look at an event where I would argue that there was loss of situational awareness, in turn leading to a tragic outcome. And finally, putting all that together, what I hope to do is share some thoughts on some tools and strategies which we as single pilots flying IFR or indeed VFR can use to help us try and maintain and manage our own situational awareness. I'll try and keep it short to about 45 minutes, and if there are some questions, we'll be happy to talk it through. So firstly, I'd like to start with what I call a common sense alert. I was lucky enough with a group of other people to own that aircraft for a few years, and when you buy an aircraft like that, it comes with one of those, like any aircraft, and inside you'll find a number of chapter headings which refer to various aspects of the aircraft, telling us how to operate it safely and within its design operating limits. Unfortunately, when it comes to the human brain, no such manual exists. So what we're talking about here is when the psychologists do observations of human behavior, what they do is develop a model, they test that in the field against real humans behaving in real ways, and then they go back and refine the model. Clearly there's no way of testing exactly how our brains work. We can only surmise from external observations. I did say I wanted to make it evidence-based, and I'll place a fair bet that very few of you, if anyone in the room knows who this is. Her name is Professor Mick Ensley, and she's got an interesting background, mainly in human factors engineering, but of particular relevance to our subject today. She was the former chief scientist of the US Air Force, and she was indeed the first human factors engineer in that role. And I'm actually grateful to Professor Ensley. She did very kindly correspond with me personally in email over the development of this talk. So I have sort of checked out this information from somebody who knows a lot more about this than I do. So what actually is situational awareness? Well, Ensley defined it as that, and I will read this one out for you. It is the perception of the elements in the environment within a volume of time and space, the comprehension of their meaning, and the projection of their status in the near future. You can actually summarize that in a very short sentence, knowing what's going on. I'd like to pick out three specific words in that definition and explore them a little further. The first is perception, the second is comprehension, and the third is projection. And actually Ensley divides this up into 3 levels of situational awareness, where perception is level 1. We can't start to understand the world around us until we actually perceive it, usually in flying through the visual senses, also audio from air traffic, what we can hear, and to some extent from what we can feel through our bodies, through our senses. Although as an instrument rating instructor, I spend most of my time discouraging my students from trusting what they feel. They need to believe what they see with their eyes, not what they feel with their other senses. Once we have actually perceived the world around us, we can move towards an understanding of it, which is an appreciation of the significance of those elements in the lives of one's goals. In this case, our goals are to successfully complete a general aviation flight. And level 3 SA is the ability to project into the future. And I would argue that actually the capability to project, to actually work out what's going to happen next if we continue a specific course of action, is probably one of the most valuable skills that a general aviation pilot can develop. So in a sense, we can think about it as an ascending triangle. First, we cannot understand the world until we perceive it, and we cannot project until we understand what we see. In one of her publications, Ensley represents this in this diagram. We have a world of which we are trying to we try and perceive it. We then work at working out what's going on, and then we try and work out what's going on in the future. Clearly, that's a loop that we're constantly going through on a practical basis. We might decide that we need more information, in which case we go back to the world around us, and that might be what we see out of the window or what we see inside the cockpit, and the whole process continues in a continuous loop. So this isn't an objective in itself. We don't try and comprehend or project just for its own benefit. We do it so that we can make a decision. I would argue, as we'll come to in a moment, that a general aviation flight consists of literally hundreds, if not thousands, of individual decisions. Some of them big, some of them small, but each can influence the outcome. And there are 2 external influences on that process. Firstly, there is us. We have our own brains. They're wired up in different ways. Everyone's brain in this room will process information in a slightly different way. That's influenced by our abilities and our training. And so we bring ourselves to this individual circumstances with all our biases, expectations, and other experiences. And secondly, we have the external processes around us. Just to give a few examples, what air traffic control are telling us to do, what the weather might be doing, what other situations traffic is around us. In her book, published in, I think it's 2011, Professor Ensley talked about the enemies of situational awareness. And she actually listed, I think, 8 different ways in which situational awareness can break down. Now, I hope you'll be pleased to know that I'm not going to go through every one of those 8 in incredible detail, because I think we'd be here much longer than we're scheduled to be. And I'm just going to pick 3 individual topics which caught my attention, particularly in the context of single pilot operations, particularly those involving IFR. And the first one is what has become known as attentional tunneling. Now, most of us realise that successful situational awareness, being aware of what's going on around us, requires attention sharing. We look out of the window, although I try and discourage my pilots from looking out the window, because on the whole, flying IFR, there's nothing out the window that's going to help you in any way, shape or form. In fact, if anything, it's likely to be a distraction. And the brain, a lot of people say they can multitask. That is not true. Nobody in this room can multitask. We only have one brain. What we do is attention switch, we time slice. We switch between different tasks, and some people can do that more effectively than others. And the sort of information that we're processing comes from a wide variety of sources. I'm talking to you mainly in the context of instrument flight, so pilots flying, being unable effectively to see out the window. Where these days we're lucky enough to have a number of very capable instrumentation systems available to us. I'm mainly going to use Garmin as an example here because many of our members' aircraft have Garmin equipment. However, for the sake of independence, other avionics manufacturers are available. We've got our primary navigation systems, we've got radios and GPS systems, we've got air traffic, we've got in-flight weather, and we're constantly being thrown, a huge amount of information is being thrown at us. And we know from experiments that it's easy for the human brain to get locked onto a single aspect, and for that individual aspect, the situational awareness may be absolutely amazingly good. But for everything else, it's really quite poor indeed, if at all. Ensley, in one of her publications, uses this diagram as an exemplar for an idea of attentional tunneling. This is our pilot on the right, and you can see that said pilot is focused on a particular data stream, and the data stream, for that particular data stream, the situational awareness is outstanding. But for everything else out there, it is completely useless. Secondly, complexity creep. Now, I can't speak for everyone in the room, but I love shiny toys. I love coming to shows like this and going around the avionics stand and working out how I can spend my next hard-earned chunk of cash and what else glowing screen I can put in my aeroplane. I just took this as one example. So if you bought that instrument, that radio, and popped it in your aircraft panel, it comes with a user manual of 45 pages long. If you put that in your panel, it comes with a user manual 405 pages long. Now, before you shout at me, well, these two devices aren't identical, I absolutely accept that. I'm just making a small point here. But because the instrument on the right is capable of far more functions than the instrument or the equipment on the left. Nonetheless, the point is well made that to really understand how this thing works and get the best out of it requires quite a lot of effort. And as I've mentioned, I spend quite a lot of time in the right-hand seat in the aircraft that I fly at our flight school. We don't have this one, we have the 650, and I can often sit there in the right-hand seat with the sort of pilot's hand hovering over the screen thinking, how do I get it to do this? And in the meantime, the aeroplane is gently wandering off where the pilot doesn't want it to go. You can probably tell by the colour of my hair that I've been doing this quite a long time. When I bought my first aeroplane, or IFR capable aeroplane, and it came with one of those, and most people in the audience are too young to recognise that. That's the thing called a Bendix King KCS 55. And it's an interesting measure of how things have changed over the years, because not that long ago, Bendix King was the premier manufacturer of avionics for the general aviation community. And then there came on this new upstart company called Garmin, I think they were called. And it's interesting, when you go downstairs now, Garmin have a massive stand, and we know them well, and we're friends with their salespeople because many of our members buy their kit. And Bendix King, they aren't even here. But it came with a user manual that was 15 pages long. If you go down again to other avionics manufacturers are available and buy the modern equivalent, it comes with a user manual of 53 pages. And of course then you hook it up to your autopilot and you hook it up to your Garmin GTM 750, and those of you who fly a lot in GA know that every aeroplane is different. If you are an Airbus A320 pilot, every Airbus A320, I'm told, is the same pretty much. If you press this button, that's what's going to happen. In a GA aircraft, as most of you know, it's absolutely not the case. And Ensley, in her publications, represents it like this. It's all very well having complexity, but that forces the pilot to go away, what does this button do? So they're going to actually put an additional workload on your brain. You haven't got just one knob to twiddle. You've got multiple layers of menus to get into and push the right button. And the third thing I'm going to talk about is the concept of the errant mental model. So you and I have a world around us, and as we fly along, we're trying to interpret that world. And we look at it through the information presented to us. As I've mentioned, I encourage my students not to look out of the window because that is purely a distraction. But what we're actually doing is taking the information from the world around us, processed through the instruments that present itself, and then trying to stick it in there. Okay? Now that's quite a complex process. As I've mentioned, you've got an awful lot of information coming at you. And what you're actually doing is kind of creating a 3D virtual reality in your brain when you are flying. And I often try this with my students. Of course, they're flying along, they can't look out of the window, and I'm saying, where's the airport? And some of them can say instantly, it's over there about 15 miles away. And some of them haven't got a clue. You know, they're being vectored around for an ILS, and they really haven't kind of thought, well, you know, where are we? What's going to happen next? And I think it's quite an interesting discussion about how you teach this, and we maybe touch on that. I did get a question on that yesterday, is how do we teach this stuff? Mental models are actually critical for maintaining situational awareness. We probably couldn't fly an aircraft without it, because if you got into an aircraft and had to relearn everything that you learned yesterday and the day before, I haven't got the brain capacity to do that. What we're doing all of the time is matching what we're seeing and interpreting against a previous experience. And that helps, obviously benefits, because it helps us to do the process more quickly, and it helps us to project, because what we're doing is that process is, aha, I did this yesterday. This air traffic controller vectored me to this downwind. I know, right, the next thing that's going to happen is I'm going to get a left turn or a right turn, and you kind of know what's going to happen. The downside is that it can lead to a couple of things going wrong. Now this is a famous one, confirmation bias. Conflicting information doesn't fit the mental model. I suspect we've all been in circumstances when flying and we're expecting to see something, and a piece of information is presented to us that doesn't fit with the mental model that we've created in here. And unfortunately, in those circumstances, the natural tendency of the human brain is just reject that information and just ignore it. Mode errors, these are incredibly common. So what is a mode error? Where the so-called system, that is the aeroplane, the automatics, everything that's happening around us is in one mode, and the pilot thinks it's in another. And I think the commonest thing I see on this is trying to fly an ILS, leaving the navigation system in GPS mode. And that works brilliantly well, because if you've gone to your Garmin GTN 650 and said procedure, select approach, ILS, whatever runway you've got, activate vectors to final, it will give you beautiful lateral guidance all the way around onto the final approach track, and you will think everything's going absolutely perfectly until you get to the top of the final approach, what we call the top of the drop in instructor series, when you're do the final descent. No green flag appears, you get no vertical guidance, and I love this in that I do quite a lot of work in the simulator as well, and as training, and it's great, and you've got to have a bit of fun as an instructor, and watching the confusion on the student's face when they come around and then they're saying, well, where's the descent path? And they go straight through the final approach fix, and Now, of course, when we're flying for real, it's a bit difficult to let this happen, because where I fly, which is at Liverpool, I might have a couple of EasyJets and a couple of Ryanairs and a couple of Wizz Airs being vectored around behind me, so I can't let the student make too many mistakes. Otherwise, I get into a little bit of a grief with the air traffic controllers. But in the sim, we can let all of that go and have lots of fun. The problem is, as a single pilot, once you're inside that tunnel, once you've persuaded yourself that everything is going according to plan, more of that in a moment, it's highly difficult to break out.